Hello and welcome to another episode of the Gritty Hour. We have a part two of a previous podcast called The State of Education, where we were discussing whether or not education has declined since the Department of Education was founded in 1977. And one of the issues that came up was unfunded mandates, and I wanted to explore that today. And with us today, I have Anthony Mannara, who teaches at Fordham University. Welcome to the Gritty Hour, Anthony.
Thank you. I'm an adjunct professor there, not a full.
Oh, very cool. And Mr. McCarthy, J.R. McCarthy, who teaches at the Clark Academy. He's been teaching for 38 years. Welcome back to the Gritty Hour, Mr. McCarthy.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Good evening, gentlemen. Professor Robert Pucci, who I believe recently retired from SUNY College. What was this? SUNY New Paltz or no?
SUNY Ulster.
SUNY Ulster.
No, Ulster County Community College.
Oh, Ulster County Community College. Okay. Well, anyway, it's a pleasure to having all three of you gentlemen on. There might be a couple of other guests if they do pop on. I'll introduce them at that time. So I'll start with you, Mr. McCarthy, about the unfunded mandates, just to take up the conversation for those who are watching this right after the part one of this series. What are your thoughts on that? And you're the one that brought it up, so I was going to ask you to elaborate if you could.
Well, I would preface anything I had to say this evening on the idea that I've had some time to think and have some time to consider my research, such as it was. And unfunded mandates are, of course, problematic. Unfunded mandates are a problem. Are they the problem? I don't think so. I think that there are certainly problems that arise as a consequence of the diversity, just the number of school systems throughout the country, and the idea that the maybe somewhat simplistic idea that what unfunded mandates are is state federal government intervention or federal government to use a brutal word, meddling in the policies of various state and local education districts. I think that when it comes to the crisis in education in this country today, the existence of mandates that are not so much unfunded as underfunded, because there have been laws in place since 1995 to prohibit, at least on its face, putting the entire onus of a given federal initiative on the backs of the state and local districts, the state departments and the local districts. When you look more closely at the problem, I think it seems that it is more often a matter of underfunded mandates than unfunded mandates. And I have another thought on the subject as to what particularly makes any kind of federal mandates problematic. But I think I've spoken enough right now.
I was going to ask. I just wanted to ask if you could clarify. Can you give us a specific for the pedestrian listener what an unfunded mandate is in the real world? Or
essentially, and I defer to the wisdom of the other gentlemen on the panel, but essentially, any federal mandate from the U.S. Department of Education for any service, any program imposed upon the state and local units without the funding or the proper funding going along with the mandate is an unfunded mandate.
I see.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah,
I was going to say, you're coming from a perspective of high school. I was just going to ask maybe Professor Pucci if he had an exposure to unfunded mandates on the college level.
Well, I know that, the colleges, entire SUNY system has been underfunded by about 33%, according to what we're supposed to be getting for years. And so I guess you could say that, even just being part of the system is underfunded. I think that, the problem with the concept of mandate, you have to realize that that's a lowest common denominator. I mean, it's like the standard that the federal government might set for something is pretty low. I have done a lot of research on literacy, for example, because I taught a course called media.
No, I think you might be freezing up a little, Professor Pucci. How about Adjunct
In
Professor
Europe
Anthony?
in 1500
I'm sorry,
was
go ahead.
25%. Wait, I just wanted to add that
Yeah.
the the literacy rate in Mississippi in 1900 was 10%. So, I mean, trying to bring up a very basic standard for everyone in the country is not a bad thing. And I don't think the Department of Education has anything to do with the lacking state of education. I think it has a lot more to do with the students' lack of motivation and parents' lack of cooperation.
What do you think is the cause of that, Professor Pucci?
I think they got out of the habit. You talked about in the last broadcast helicopter parents, and you would think that, oh, okay, so they're very engaged and they're very interested in their children's education, but they're not. They're only interested in their students, their children's grades. They don't care whether they're educated or not. They just care that they get an A, and that's a problem.
That's a very good point. Yeah. How about you, Anthony? Any kind of exposure to that kind of a situation at your college?
Well, I also teach at Hunter, and Hunter used to be a free college since 1976. Now people have to sort of buy in, and the tuition may be lower than other schools, but it's a CUNY school. And funding is, I think, an issue that's always going to be. It's always going to be there. However, having stepped into the classroom, I've been teaching there for about 6 years now, and I teach securities and investment analysis. And I was really sort of surprised at the productivity features of teaching that have been integrated with technology since I was in the college. Many years ago, I went to Vassar. And it's interesting to note. I mean, we all sit there and we all say, you need more money. Yes, you're always going to need more money because we're in a continuous evolution in our society, I think, of what we need to know and how we're going to change. And change is always tough because reading from your last podcast, what I heard was, there were things where students were very narrow about, what they knew. They didn't know capital cities. They didn't understand geography. They weren't trained properly. Yeah, but I mean, they're spending a lot of time on the internet, and they know much more than I do, for example, on how to use social media to their advantage. These are all new things that have been introduced since I was in college. And I think it's time consuming. And I think it's also, I did pick up on the social behavior that's changed as well because of the technology. And I agree with you. I mean, I can't get my two boys to sit at the table without them touching their phone. And I say, no phones at the table. There's a whole etiquette that has to come along with the evolution of education and what has interfered and disrupted our educational system. And it's almost like, what is it that we have to guide it towards? It's changed. The world has changed, and we're trying to squeeze productivity out of the education of the people that we have there. To top it off, we have an influx of international people that have come into this country more readily lately, that have taken up and bid up the tuition costs of colleges. So yeah, there's a big integration of a big mismatch of factors that come into play here. And I mean, it's not something that it's uncomfortable, because it's not like the time that there was available for education when you and I went to college. There was a teacher, there was a blackboard, the teacher would teach you. It would be a much more personal. Now I teach, and I've got slides that are prepared for me by, McGraw-Hill. I've got an online system where the students go and do their homework and do the reading, and I monitor whether they've done their reading and homework. And it's all a different approach towards education. And there is accountability in it, but we're relying on technology to displace some of the, I'd say, some of the calls for that cash that have come from the government in the past. I don't know if that's right. I don't know if it's wrong. All I can say is, in teaching my courses, we do, I think, a pretty good job. It's almost like they sit back and watch a screen, because very much it's audio visual. I have slides, they prompt me on how to lecture, and every time I change a slide, I talk about whatever the situation is. It prompts me to give the lecture on what happens in that chapter, and they're absorbing it almost like television, only you're there, and there's also interaction with questions and answers. So it's a different way of teaching, I think, and I think that in the end, I'm hoping it comes out to be as good as it should be. You were talking also about athletics and why they were disincentivized or not funded in programs in college in the past, or in high school. And I've had the luxury of living in a foreign country, in Italy. I lived there for 22 years, and my kids grew up in the Italian educational system. And I can tell you that there is no emphasis on athletics whatsoever. There is no program in the high school. There's no competition. That it's rare that you're going to find a school team anywhere. So the parents are forced to look for leagues for their kids.
And they do. That was a point that I was going to make. Is there a need for athletics in the schools when, for example, my little daughter is ice skating, basketball, and swimming at the age of 7? And by the time she gets to high school, she will have, narrowed that down to something she might be interested in, or maybe not.
The point is, look, I used to be an athlete. I played 4 years of college basketball. I think one of the characteristics, I also worked on Wall Street, and I still work on Wall Street. What we looked, when we interviewed candidates for jobs, we always looked for, it wasn't necessarily achievement in academics. It could have been excellence in something that they were champion at. And it could have been karate, it could have been basketball, it could have been football, but we looked for the person that excelled in a certain area in order to get him into a job, because he knew what it took to become a champion. And that's what I think the rounded part of getting into, I mean, what we're all interested in education is getting that person into a job and getting him employed. And I think it could be in a broad sense. I think that there should be college basketball and football. However, I also noticed when I went to Vassar, there were no matching sneakers, matching colors. It was all like I wore my Converse sneakers to go play. Converse sneakers were canvas. Now you got the $200 pair that has to match every student. It's become a 5-star hotel. I mean, in college. It's luxury. It's really luxury when you come out of it.
And it's driven up the cost of tuition at those colleges quite a bit, even though there is revenue coming in from those programs.
But it's forcing it. The NCAA has certain standards that they have to abide by. They have to have a luxurious basketball court where the teams can play. There's certain investments you have to make to be in the NCAA. So it's a perpetual thing that is keeping up, keeping up, keeping up. I'm on the board of my co-op here, and just running a co-op building, there's always a new regulation. There's always a new thing you got to, new code that you have to combine. The cost of maintenance goes up. It's the same thing. It's like this evolution of what's the infrastructure around that institution. So getting back to education, I think, you want the 5-star hotel. Okay, we got to redo the dorms. We got to have certain number of student teacher ratio. You want that quality of education, then yes, you got to have more money. You got a bid up from foreign students coming in from all over the world who are paying these ridiculous sums for tuition, which also, and then they say, well, we counteract that by giving you, I'm sorry, I'm rattling on and on.
That's
but
all right.
we counteract that by giving you foreign scholarship money or financing, college financing. So, it's not that bad. Then did you ever try getting some kind of financing out of a college? It's an impossible feat. You already have the stress of the SATs to get your kids into college. Now
You have
you're
to fill out that FAFSA form.
Huh?
A lot of students, for example, at Ulster County Community College pay very little.
Right.
They do have financial aid. I think in a way it's a good thing that they can go, but I also think that it's something that sort of discourages being very diligent about going to class. I've had students who I think they feel because the money was paid for credits that they will get the credits whether they do any work or not, and that's a terrible problem. And I think that's the real problem in education, is that the students have a very sort of passive idea as to what they should be doing. I've had students who say something like, well, just tell me what I need to know. And I always say, I have no idea what you need to know. I mean, that's something that you've got to figure out. And I think that is part of the problem. If you are teaching to a test, if you are studying to a test, and you are trying to get a good grade, and that's what you're interested in, well, I think it's very easy to play the game. You play the game, you fill out my daughter got terrible marks at Our Lady of Lourdes, far about 10 or 15 points less than what she should have. Why? She never did her homework. Homework was like 10 or 15%, and she never did her homework. So that was minus that. All she had to do was play the game. So I think it's important that students develop their own sense of drive, their own sense of excellence, their own sense of standard. Because if they don't, they're trusting the waves of whatever they've got in front of them. Is their instructor very good? I don't know. We've had situations where we have a lot of adjunct instructors. Some of them are just kind of like, filling in, if you will. They're not really dedicated necessarily to the subject matter. Not saying that you're not, because it's a very sort of specialized area. But when we're talking about things like public speaking or English 101, a lot of times the adjunct way, if you will, is to give everybody an A. Let the next college sort them out.
Right.
And that's problematic.
I do have one question. I just wanted to interrupt. Bringing it back to athletics, I think that there should be athletics in colleges and things, only because not everybody grows at the same pace. Like you said, at 18, you're sort of forced into this obligation of going to college, and not everybody's ready for it. So,
or should go.
Right, or should go. And so you could also get away with getting into college because of your expertise in some athletic state and trying to absorb, once you're there, what it is that you've got to learn, but grow at your own pace. If I'm playing 5 hours a day of basketball, I'm not going to have a lot of time to do my homework and to do all my study. So I'll be a happy B minus student going through as an athlete. And hopefully down the road, when I am more motivated, if I go to a graduate program or whatever it is, I will be ready. But you got to educate people. But I think this ABC stuff that has to be, you got to be 750 board, you got to get an A, you got to do all of this stuff, is just a little bit too restrictive. And I think athletics it actually adds a complement to an environment by letting people who are good at other stuff be a part of the college or the undergrad or whatever it is that we're talking about, to sort of round out the type of person that goes to these schools.
Well,
Mm.
Mr.
Well, one of-
McCarthy, I'm sorry, Professor. I was going to ask Mr. McCarthy, Anthony's point before about it seemed to me like he was trying to describe the current state of education holistically as being in a period of adapting to the current needs of society. Do you agree with that at all?
I think that it is the essence of education to be constantly adapting to the needs of society. But there is also supposed to be at the core of all truly sincere and efficient education, a core value of basic academic skill to be enhanced over time, so that not only do students become more well-rounded as their education progresses, but they can integrate in the fullness of time the new technology, the new ideas, the new trends. I came at this conversation, Tom, as you know, casting a cold eye on the idea that any kind of interference with the basic curriculum was problematic. But I've always held to the idea that a decent teacher, a teacher who is truly committed to what I have always called cultural literacy, coming as I do into education in the mid 80s. I've never been anything but a high school teacher. I have been a social studies teacher and an English teacher my entire career. And for the last 16 years, I've been working in a very specialized special needs environment for emotionally and behaviorally challenged adolescents. And there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of interference, and there are a lot of new ideas that come in various stages of readiness. But I think it's the job of a good teacher to funnel out as much of that noise as possible and to strike a balance between the kind of integration that I think Anthony was talking about and the kind of core value that that not only motivated me in the first place, but continues to motivate me. I believe, as Stephen Mintz, the historian and educator, recently said, that my job is to ensure that students become broadly literate in terms of cultural knowledge, even if that requires extending beyond my course's boundaries. I have always thought that certainly it is important to prepare students for livelihood, but preparation for livelihood is in vain if they're not prepared for life, if they don't have an informed and integrated idea about what their culture is and what their culture ought to be. And I'm sorry, I'm rambling once again. You asked me for the time and I built you a watch. But what has befuddled me for almost 40 years now is the kids are coming to me with less and less of the basic skills that would be necessary for me to be able to offer them better and more challenging and more broadening educational experiences. And I defer to these gentlemen, and I think everything that they've said is on point. But I would add to that, that people like myself bear the main responsibility for the decline in education, because as difficult and as demanding and as frustrating as the job can be, it is our obligation to uphold cultural and literary and educational standards, in spite of the noise and in spite of the trends. And while we wait to see what coming down the pike represents real and lasting and meaningful change that will uplift other communities and perpetuate the values that we're supposed to be inculcating in our students, and what amounts to a flash in the pan, or what amounts to a distraction of the moment. It's not an easy job, and I'm sure these gentlemen will agree with me. Whatever side of the street you're working on, it's not an easy job. But that's what you signed on for, and you have that responsibility. And at the end of the day, if kids do not come to high school sufficiently literate and sufficiently numerate to achieve in even the most traditional secondary curriculum, who is ultimately who either should bear the responsibility of that or must now bear the responsibility of that? It's people like myself. It's teachers in the classroom.
Well, do any of the three you gentlemen, when you get a class, a new crop of students come in, do you see that they're not as fundamentally sound educationally than they used to be earlier in your careers?
Well, I started teaching college in 1979, and I can tell you that over the years, the preparedness has dropped considerably. Speaking of, has almost disappeared. I had a theater class, and they had never heard of the Marx Brothers. No, none of them. And I'm like, well, it's sort of like, what is your involvement in this? I have a story that goes back to when I was working in television. We had a young lady who was the anchor, and she was a graduate of Marist College. And she stopped the newsroom dead with the following question: what came first, the revolution or the Civil War? And no one knew what to say. And I said, well, Trish, first there was the revolution, then there was the Civil War, and then to make things easier in the 20th century, they started to number them. And I don't think she got it. She didn't get the insult. And it was like, but she had an attitude, which I've seen in other students, that if it happened before I was born, it doesn't matter, and that the sort of, there's no shame, in students not knowing basic information. Now, I have to say, when they do those on the spot interviews and they ask people, capital of whatever, obviously, we don't know how many people they asked, how many people got it right. We're only hearing the people who came up with the most outrageously bad answers.
Well, that's true. Yes.
But on the other hand, those people are not ashamed. They're not ashamed that they don't know. And that's part of the problem.
Professor,
my son beat up your honor student bumper sticker.
Go ahead, Mr. McCarthy.
Professor, in the last time we had this conversation, I shared a story about a student of mine, an 18-year-old boy, 6 months from graduation, who asked me one day why rain does not extinguish the fire of the sun. And at the risk of rehashing that whole story again, my gut reaction to that was, somebody dropped the ball here. This isn't just a matter of somebody not paying attention. This is not just a matter of somebody dismissing anything that happened before they were born as irrelevant to life. I'm delighted to say that the Civil War and the Revolution also happened before I was born. But it's still incredibly important to me. And I felt from the very beginning that I had a responsibility to pass on that sense of how very important it was to know these things. As you just alluded to the young lady in the newsroom, you answered her question. You answered her question succinctly, and you even answered the question wittily to both, dull the edge of whatever embarrassment she might have felt, and maybe even, and I'm reading perhaps too much into this, maybe even encouraging her not to hesitate to ask a question like that again, regardless of how it might make her look or sound. I said it when I was talking about this before, about the kid who asked me about the sun. I am so relieved that he had the courage to ask. And not for nothing, because I myself had a wonderful education. I was in a position to answer. I was in a position to drop everything I was doing and in 5 minutes bring him up to speed on the solar centric theory. Not because I'm an astronomer or because I'm a guru, but because I got a decent education.
Right.
And that decent education has been the fuel that has both powered my my efforts when I'm successful, and reminded me when I'm frustrated and feel like I'm getting nowhere, that it starts with me.
Well, I grew up in the South Bronx, and I had a string of very dedicated teachers who were battling against enormous odds, just to get things done. And I remember a couple of them, Mr. Lozano, who in the 7th grade decided we all needed to read the New York Times, and insisted that we read it, and gave us quizzes on it. Now, when I taught media literacy, I thought it would be a great idea to have a quiz once a week on current events. After 3 weeks with no one getting more than 20 on the quiz, I stopped. And I think that, it's just incredible to me that this ability to be unaware of things outside of your immediate circle, sort of puts us back in the Middle Ages, where no one traveled more than 50 miles from where they were born. And didn't know. And I always thought there was the great joke in Monty Python, The Holy Grail, where they said, that's the king. And he says, how do you know he's the king? He doesn't have any shit on him. It's just like, oh yeah, there's a portrait on a coin. Yeah, they all look alike.
How about you, Professor Mannara? How about yourself? You're at Hunter and Fordham. Have you seen a decline in the quality of, I should say, a decline in the fundamentals from your newer students?
I haven't been teaching as long as Professor Pucci or Professor McCarthy. I've had 6 years of adjunct work that I started to do. I taught in Italy 1 semester, but it was 30 years ago. But I knew I liked education. I do. I honestly do, because I've helped people, with their paths towards finding their educational path. One thing I do note, there is a huge difference. Hunter, the student body there is generally first generation American. And I think an understanding of the way this country works, the democratic process, the legislative branch, the Senate, understanding how laws are made, does not get communicated well enough to the students in the school. And I think that's a weakness, whereas, I think there are many first generations in other colleges, also at Fordham, but I'm just saying, if your parents grew up in this society and they've had a decent education, you're a second generation, that helps. I think it helps a lot. The people, you could go back to your parents, you could say, Mom, did I write this essay well? They may not be foreign speaking and, have a command of the English language better than a person who immigrated into this country. So there's less of a resource for those people. And time is just another thing. It's just another thing. I think this infusion of technology that has started, like when we started getting mobile phones in the 90s that you carry in your pocket, and you're competing for time. That's all it is. People are on TikTok. They're playing with TikTok. They're not doing their homework. They're watching videos. So it's just amazing. It just kills me.
And also one of the questions I always ask my students when they're coming in, I in this media and society class, I ask them to give me a breakdown of their media diet. And one of the questions is, how much time do you spend doing discretionary reading?
Right.
And it's almost zero. They don't read newspapers, they don't read magazines. And I would say 20 years ago, when I was teaching the class, I'd get to the magazine portion of media and society, and most of the students subscribed to at least 2 magazines. Now they might have been, things like,
Popular Mechanics or something.
Popular Mechanics. It didn't matter,
Right.
but every month they felt a strong enough commitment to a body of knowledge that they wanted the latest.
Well, how
they
about
were following something.
how about reading books for leisure? Do you get any of those?
No. I mean, very little discretionary reading.
Mhm.
I was told to read this, and I didn't read
Yeah.
it. 60% of students don't buy the textbook. And it's kind of like it's very hard. I remember when I went to college, it's sort of like, well, you sort of had to read.
Mm.
You had to read the textbook, and you had to be ready for to answer questions and to write papers, and when you think about it, if you get out of that, if you get to a point where someone lets you sort of answer questions about a story, without writing an essay and without having to, create some kind of structure, introduction, body, conclusion, having some kind of critical input, and you're just sort of spitting back the what's of things, you are not prepared to write a college essay. I have a colleague who also retired. He's teaching a 101 class, and he
Professor, I'm sorry.
he's
Yeah.
probably going to fail about half. Just to say, they're failing because they don't do the work. They don't turn in the essays.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean to interrupt. Your connection is a little choppy. That's why I was talking over you. I apologize for that. But Professor Mannara, I was going to ask you, do you have the opportunity, you had mentioned first generation Americans. Do you have the opportunity to compare that to surely the second, third generation Americans in those colleges also? Do you have that opportunity to compare the results between first generation Americans and?
Yeah, what I'm saying is it's evident because part of whatever exams I give, I want to see the literacy of the actual textbook that they're supposed to be reading come across with the particular language of like macroeconomics or whatever it is that they're taking. So I say, look, you're gonna have 2 essays, you're gonna have to write, then we'll have some multiple choice questions. And those that are able to articulate better their language, come across. I said, that's what's going to matter when you're interviewing. When you're getting a job, the guy's going to want to talk to you about diminishing marginal returns, and you got to understand what diminishing marginal returns is. So you got to be able to use the phrases that are associated with that particular text. And I think, from what my observations are, is that people who have read and who have had English-speaking parents in the educational system then have an advantage.
Okay.
Because they have the ability to go back or talk to their parents about, what does this mean? How do I get this explained? Can you talk to me about it? Whereas, there might be some country where Sri Lanka or, you might have somebody from Bombay coming in. Actually, those are English speaking. What if you have somebody from the Middle East?
Mm-hmm.
That's coming in, and the father, is not even living in the same country sometimes, so they don't have these resources, and I do notice that there is, they're smart. You can tell they're smart because they participate, they get their multiple choice correct, whatever it is, but they can't do the essay part as well, and that's clear to me.
That's a
And,
good point. Mr. McCarthy, do you have an influx of first generation Americans or even
Almost to a student.
new arrivals?
Almost to a student.
Hmm.
yeah, really.
And they're all over the map when it comes to their exposure to and their partaking in any kind of literature or any kind of print material. I would imagine that most of them don't, and don't to the depressing degree that's been suggested here. But some of them do. You know, they read graphic novels, they read manga. They're plugged into all kinds of alarming and provocative internet sites that are polemical, to put it mildly, and tend to skew their opinions before we even get a chance to get into any discourse. But what it is across the board is not so much a poverty as an impoverishment, that the ones who are reading stuff that ain't so good for them, but you long to channel that into something more edifying, something more useful to them, something more nourishing to them. You didn't specifically ask me about their literary habits. You asked me more about their cultural demographic, as it were. And basically, for the whole, I taught 22 years in the Bronx before I taught where I teach now. The school I teach now is a special acts school that basically serves the 5 boroughs. So though I have a substantial number of students who are coming from upstate New York and Long Island, the core of my student population is Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, and a little bit of Manhattan. And they're kids whose needs could not be met in the districts where they came from. And they are, in many ways, a shockingly misinformed and uninformed group. But they are also clearly thirsty and you know what? And amongst us guys, I think they're a little angry, to say the least, that something that was supposed to be given to them has not yet quite made it to them in terms of what I would, loftily call their cultural legacy. I think they know that they've been had. And, it doesn't really dispose them towards, the trust and the compliance that would make it easier for them to heed the advice of so wise a man as myself.
Well, are the bulk of these children you're talking about now, are they immigrants themselves or children of immigrants?
There is a substantial minority who are immigrants, and for the most part from South Asia right now, for the most part from India and Pakistan. But the healthy majority of my students are first generation American, the second generation American, African American. Most of them born in this country, most of them raised in this country.
Okay.
Well, I would make a point that, I taught for 8 years at Ostos Community College in the South Bronx. And most of those students were first generation, and many of them, their parents did not speak English or speak English well. But they were far more motivated than the sons and daughters of Ulster County. I was thinking, could I come up with an analogy? Samuel Beckett at one point taught when he was younger, and he taught at this exclusive school in Ulster, Northern Ireland, and he said that he taught the cream of Ulster society, rich and thick. Yeah, and it's sort of like, well, the students that I got at Ulster were far less appreciative of your efforts. They were not as willing to try to stretch out and do the work. And the other ones were greatly motivated. I had one student came to me and said, you know, my math class here at Ostos is not as good as the class I had in Puerto Rico. And I said, well, I said, transfer to Baruch. A lot of the better students at Ostos wound up going to Baruch because I said, you know, you're wasting your time here, you know, and that is something that I rarely ran into at Ulster. I said at Ulster, you know, I had communication and media arts majors. And I said it was like a single A baseball team, 1 or 2 prospects and the rest there to fill out the class.
There are still parents who are dedicated to the notion that education is the silver bullet, that education is what is going to better the lot of their children. And I have seen in all of my years absolutely heroic extremes that parents have gone to, just especially when I was teaching in the Catholic school, but just so the kids could go to the school. Tom, I think I might have told the story the last time we were speaking about a couple of young ladies that I taught at Scanlon High School, and they were sisters, a year apart, and mom and dad drove a gypsy cab, and mom drove it during the day and dad drove it at night. And that's what they did to make sure that their girls could go to our school. And when I came to know that, and that's just one example of many heroic examples I could give you, you know, I felt like I had a sacred obligation to honor that sacrifice.
So they did that
To honor
sacrifice.
that, right? To
No, I was
honor the
gonna-
trust, right?
They didn't want them to go to public school. Is that what you're trying to say?
They wanted them to go to Scanlon as opposed to public school in the Bronx. They wanted them to go to Scanlon for whatever they believed that, and hopefully, in my opinion, rightfully so, about Scanlon as a place where the kids would get a wonderful education. And their sacrifice was at least as dramatic a sacrifice as any I had ever heard of in my own days as a kid, growing up as I did among you know, immigrants and first generation Americans who were absolutely determined at any cost to make sure that their children got the best education possible. That's still out there. But as the professor said, you know, that there are still some appalling examples of people who take quite the opposite tack and are more, you said something earlier, Professor, about how they're more motivated to make sure their kids get the grades as opposed to get the education. And I think that's a critical distinction, because nothing aids me more in my work than the parent who is committed to getting a kid a good education. And nothing hurts me more than a parent who is hectoring me to make sure that the kid gets, you know, the grade at all costs. And, you know, again, I'm rambling, so I'll leave it at that.
No, it's a good point, and I appreciate Professor Mannara bringing that up, because if we do have if we do acknowledge a decline in our education, that has to be a factor. The newer immigrants coming in, children of immigrants, and that's been the case for the entire history of our country, though. Right, we are an immigrant country, always have been.
Well,
I'm a first. Just to clarify, I'm a first generation American as well. So, and I've lived it. You know, my parents, my father was a doctor. He was born in America, and at age 5, moved back to Italy. My mother was from Rome, so then they came back because my father's parents lived in the U.S. And after the war, where he was a medic, he fought under Mussolini and all of that stuff, he came back to New York. But I was born in New York with a sister, and the two of us were the first ones to be educated in this country. So I understand, you know, the drawbacks of having and advantages. I mean, I have a rich cultural background and actually married an Italian and lived in Italy, and it was a wonderful time. And so I was culturally rich, which is part of your education. And I got that sort of in life as well as from my schools. But, it's tough to cram everything in at an early age. In Italy, their educational system, for example, the way I see it is, do you know the difference between an EEPROM and a DRAM? Like an EEPROM is a microprocessor. That's what I think the tools that Americans get. And the DRAMs are just like storage of knowledge. Italians get beaten up to like the hilt as to cultural events and knowledge and background, understanding of geography, knowing what's going on. They could keep you entertained at a cocktail party for 4 hours and you don't even know what you're talking about.
Well, I was going to ask any of the three of you if among the new immigrants, say students, has any of them voiced a difference between the American system and from where they came? And that would be for
Well,
any.
sometimes,
Yeah.
For the students at Ostos, some of them had maybe a better educational experience in their home country, Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, maybe because there was an old-fashioned standard of what they had to do or accomplish, and they would talk to that, and they would say that somehow, what some of the instructors anyway were asking of them was too little. And I thought about that, and I said, really intelligent, motivated people are probably going to be bored in a lot of classes, and that's because even if the instructor is not teaching to the lowest common denominator, they have to talk to the average. And if you're brighter than that, you're going to be bored. So I always created assignments that allowed the people who were more brilliant to be brilliant. They had an opportunity to shine and to challenge them. And I've had some students who've gone on. I've got one now who's a PhD candidate. But a lot of them were just like, tell me what I need to know. I got this great story. I was teaching a class in set design, and one of the things they had to do was make a model. And so the models were all on display. And a student came up to me and said, you only gave me a B on my model. And I said, yeah, well, it was this, it was this, it was this. And it was, well, why can't I have an A? And I pointed to the model that got an A. And I said, well, that's what an A model looks like. And she said to me, well, couldn't you give that person an A++? And I was like, no, I can't.
The underlying current of all three of you gentlemen's conversation tonight is it's a lot of frustration that goes into your profession in having to deal with certain elements of it.
It's very complicated. It is. Yeah. And, we have a very fast moving world right now, and technology has only sped it up more, and it's affecting everything, including education. So, it's a tough job. And I think it's it's not looked at as very rewarding, or it doesn't reward the teachers as much as they should get rewarded. But then again, we're talking about funding. So where does the money come from? It's got to come from within. It's got to really, your motivation to teach is really sort of got to come from within, and it's a little bit of giving back, And
I think I mentioned in a previous podcast, somebody once mentioned to me that was a teacher that he felt that at least 80% of the people that go to college shouldn't go to college. And
we talked about that tonight too, right?
Maybe, yeah. And the other thing that sticks out that somebody else had mentioned to me, another gentleman, was that if money could fix the education system, it would be fixed by now. Because we do spend,
right. Well,
the GDP and equal of many countries.
War on drugs would have succeeded.
Yeah, well, that's the point. Yeah,
and we would feel safe at half the military budget.
So it's sort of like
money does not work.
Right. Money's not the answer. You're absolutely right.
But is it the distribution of the money that is in play that's not being properly allocated? Because I also got the feeling from the three talking tonight that, as an example, an adjunct doesn't get paid as much, or as Mr. McCarthy was referring to before, some of the federal mandates are underfunded. So is it a misallocation, or where are we going with that?
Well, I know if you spend nearly $1 trillion on a military that has won a war since World War II, you might want to reallocate some of that money.
Well, I'm talking about the money that is already being allocated to the education system.
Right, but I'm saying that the priority of funding on the federal level is not for education.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And it
Yeah.
should be, and it should be more and less for bombs, because quite frankly, they don't work.
Right. So, but just to get back to Tom's point, I think what he's saying is, with what we have as resources for education, are they being deployed properly? Right? Are they
That was
being
my
Yeah,
point.
yeah.
Yes.
And I don't know. That seems like a complex issue in and of itself, and I don't know whether it's being put to the right use or not. What I can tell you is there are overhead projectors in the schools. There are erasable markers with whiteboards. Classes get renovated every once in a while. There are computers in every classroom. So I mean, it's like they're adapting, and I think technology, they realize that there's greater returns from having the technology than not having it. So that money seems to have been appropriately allocated. I don't know if it's the same with Professor McCarthy's high school or not, but
You edify me once again, Anthony, by referring to me as Professor McCarthy. It's JR.
Well,
I am not now, nor have I ever been a professor.
okay,
but,
well, I
you
think
know,
a member
you
of
are,
the
but
Communist
so you
Party.
are.
Well, Joe McCarthy
wanted to
tell
be.
me. Yes. But the night is young. I agree with you 100%, and I would say that, in fairness to the school where I teach, they have stepped up their game quite a bit in the last 5 years, and I have much more technology at my disposal than ever I did before. And on the one hand, it is a boon, but on the other hand, it's very important, and this is unfortunately going to have to be a conversation for another time, I think. It's very important that technology augments education as opposed to replacing it.
Right.
I don't want to besmirch some of the very fine people I work with by telling a story that makes them all sound bad. But when we talked about a zero tolerance policy in the classroom for cell phones, when we talked about not under any circumstances allowing them to have the cell phones at all, one or two of my colleagues balked, because how are the kids going to look up answers if they don't have their cell phones? And I was just, dumbstruck.
Or how are they going to fact check the professor to make sure he's not
Right.
bullshitting? That's the
Right,
thing.
right, okay,
They do
yeah,
that.
well, yeah,
They
all
sit
right,
there,
listen.
they look up what you just said, and if it's not true, they'll say, "Oh, there's a problem here."
Yeah, but I got to tell you that they rarely catch me. Because at the end of the day, I have to answer to a higher authority. But no, you better
No,
have
I
your
understand.
facts straight if you drop a little fact bomb in the classroom, because they
Right.
will check. And
Right.
that's another example of how it is one thing to equip somebody with state-of-the-art technology. It is another thing to teach them to use it prudently and efficiently. And
Right.
there's the rub. And
Yeah.
if
I think there's
any tool in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon.
True.
right. I think sometimes there's a disconnect between the idea of, well, technology is taking care of that. Kind of like, I don't have to proofread what I've written because I ran it through spell check. And even though I remember once reading in a publication, an art publication that was written by an article, someone I know, I said, I think you wanted to say phenomenon and not pheromone. And it was, but that was how it was spell checked and
Right, but
obviously
Yes.
not
It was a
proofread.
Yes.
word.
It's the autocorrect that drives me up the wall.
Well, that's the autocorrect, you
Yeah.
know.
What Mr. McCarthy
Sort of
said
like,
when
I
Mr.
don't think
McCarthy
he wanted to say that.
when Mr. McCarthy was just talking, he said this could be a conversation for another time, and I have used up all three of you gentlemen's time tonight, which I do appreciate you coming on. But I know we have the holidays coming up, but early in the new year, I'd like to have you all back. And one of the comments that stuck out to me from the first podcast that Mr. McCarthy took part in was that we just scratched the surface. And I think we dug a little deeper today. There was some aspects that I appreciated that Anthony brought up, especially about adaptive technology and the new immigrants and such. All of them affect the results that we get for the dollar that we spend. So if you guys are willing, I'd like to have you back early in 2023 and maybe propel this conversation further. And I certainly do appreciate your time tonight. That's
I couldn't ask for a better commute, Tom.
yeah. Yeah. All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you
Take care.
again. And I hope you have this will actually air after Thanksgiving, but we're recording before Thanksgiving. So I'm going to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to you.
gentlemen. Thank
Okay.
you all.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Tom.
All right. And we'll talk again
Take
soon.
care.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Bye-bye.
Take care.